it could borrow up to about $125 billion. So we have $25 to $30 billion of room.
The group claims that many so-called sinkhole cities have more bond debt obligations than they're reporting publicly. They focus on underfunded pensions and retiree health benefits that are owed to public employees.
Okay. How does the debt ceiling work? Okay. We're learning shit today.
The federal debt ceiling. It's a looming catastrophe. It's a bargaining lever. It's a crisis averted. It seems like a never-ending cycle. So what is the federal debt ceiling anyway, and why should you care about it? Let's start with how it works. The government spends more money than it takes in. It's done this off and on since the country was founded. But now it's doing it more than ever. In each of the past 4 years, it has spent over $1 trillion more than it took in. In February of this year, it is projected to collect about $215 billion in revenues and pay out $460 billion. The government borrows to make up the difference by selling bonds to investors around the world. Nearly half of that debt is now held by foreigners, much of it by Japan and China. Each month that the government spends more than it brings in, that is, each month that the government runs a deficit, it has to borrow. The sum of all this borrowing is the federal debt. It's been growing, both in dollars and measured against the size of the economy. Until World War I, Congress had to vote each time the Treasury needed to borrow money. To give the Treasury more flexibility, Congress switched to setting a ceiling on the debt in 1917. When the debt bumps up against that limit, Congress, often with a lot of shouting and bargaining, votes to lift the ceiling. And that is where we are now. The government hit the $16.4 trillion federal debt ceiling on December 31st, so Congress suspended the ceiling, allowing the Treasury to borrow what it needs, but only through May 19th. Well, you have to understand the debt ceiling is a strange thing. First, Congress votes to spend money the government doesn't have. Then it votes a second time to allow Treasury to borrow that money so it can spend. Refusing to raise the debt ceiling does not cut spending. It's like refusing to pay a credit card bill for stuff you've already bought. But because failure to raise the debt limit could be so devastating, Congress often does use it to force the president to do things he's reluctant to do. Nobody really knows. The Treasury hasn't been in precisely this position before. But here are some rough guesses. When the Treasury faced similar circumstances back in 2011, it contemplated paying as many bills as it could each day with the cash it had on hand, delaying payment on the rest. Bills would be paid basically in the order in which they arrived. The longer the delay in raising the debt ceiling, the more bills would pile up. Physicians who rely on Medicare payments to make payroll, seniors who pay rent with Social Security benefits, or soldiers waiting for paychecks would be forced to make do without their money for some time. Another option would be for the Treasury to prioritize payments, choose some bills to pay on time and others to delay. But it's unclear whether this is legal or logistically possible, given the volume of bills the Treasury receives each day. Nor is it clear whether the Treasury could or would pay interest on the national debt before paying everyone else. Any delays in paying interest would endanger the government's credit rating and shake confidence around the world in the ability of the U.S. government to manage its finances. That could lead investors to demand higher interest rates for U.S. Treasury bonds, which would cost American taxpayers billions of dollars over time. Those are the stakes. And as the debt continues to rise, Washington faces a decision. Will it come to an agreement on taxes and spending? Will it actually do something to slow the buildup of debt? Or will the debt ceiling come back into the headlines, and with it the accompanying fear that the U.S. government won't be able to pay its bills?
In order to avoid
an economic and financial catastrophe
by defaulting, Democrats and Republicans have to agree to raise the debt ceiling by early June. The negotiations are ongoing.
There's no agreement. We're still apart.
I've done my part.
But what if there were options for the White House to go around Congress to avoid a default, even if they're not better ones?
If Congress does not address the debt limit, there are no good options the Treasury or the government can use to save us from catastrophe.
Any deviations from that path would be highly risky.
Highly risky and highly unlikely, but some are really being considered.
I think it is worth taking seriously. They're all bad, but how they compare to the badness of default.
Here are the 3 risky, unlikely, but not improbable paths Biden could take to avoid a default. Let's start with the first one, the $1 trillion
Alright, so I think I'm getting it. You have to raise the ceiling.
coin. A bill in the 90s aimed at making it easier
I'm trying to figure out how do you start paying that back then? You would have
mint
to
commemorative
figure out how they
coins.
find the difference.
Technically
of the money.
does say that the Treasury Secretary can mint and issue platinum coins in any denomination. So the thought is, why not mint one for $1 trillion and then have enough money to not need to take on more debt?
I think the platinum coin is the most unlikely.
Jason Furman was President
Yeah, that's
Obama's
kinda
top
crazy.
economist and was at the White House during the first big debt ceiling crisis.
I remember in 2011, I read about the platinum coin on a blog post someone sent me. I went to Tim Geithner, who was then Treasury Secretary, just in the hallway before a meeting and said, "Hey, what do you think of the platinum coin?" He's like, "The platinum what?" And I'm like, "Oh, the platinum coin. We can mint a platinum coin." He's like, "Yeah, what are you talking about? That's crazy."
The current Treasury Secretary feels similarly.
It's really a gimmick.
The Treasury also can't just mint the coin and automatically start spending it.
They would need money in what is essentially their checking account, which is held at the Federal Reserve. And so you would need them to bring that $1 trillion coin to the Federal Reserve to accept it, and then credit the government's checking account with $1 trillion, and then the federal government could use that money.
But it's not clear the Federal Reserve would even accept the coin.
There are no rabbits to be pulled out of hats here. This only ends with
I know you don't like yes or no's, but if you were sent $1 trillion coin and asked to treat it as $1 trillion, will you treat it as $1 trillion?
That would be a rabbit coming out of a hat.
The second, but slightly more likely option is the Treasury issuing premium bonds. The way the Treasury takes on debt in the first place is by selling bonds. A $1,000 10-year bond with a 3% interest rate, also called a coupon rate, would pay $30 every year for 10 years, so it's really worth $1,300. By the way, these interest payments are one of many government expenses that are due regularly, and if the Treasury doesn't have enough money to pay them, like they say they won't if the debt ceiling isn't raised by the X date, around June 1st, that's a default.
The world has never doubted that America will pay the principal and interest on its bonds. A default would crack open the foundations upon which our financial system is built.
The Treasury auctions off bonds and maybe gets $1,100 for
That is true.
bond. They've brought in an extra $100 in revenue. When the debt ceiling is hit, they aren't allowed to take on new debt by issuing new bonds, but they could reissue bonds. If an old $1,000 bond's term is ending, they could put that bond back up for auction. It's not new debt, but they could reissue with a higher coupon rate, say 10%. Then the bond would be worth $2,000 over 10 years. It could bring in more money at auction to fund the government without technically taking out new debt.
Even the proponents of premium bonds would admit that they are a bad idea compared to raising the debt limit. Launching a brand new type of bond that pays a very high coupon payment so it has a lower face value in the middle of a financially turbulent period would be a real recipe for a lot of financial market chaos. Now, you do need to compare that chaos to the chaos you would get if you went past the X date and started not paying your obligations. So this becomes a, comparison of different forms of poison.
The third and most likely option.
You could call it the most likely option, but I'd rather call it the least unlikely option.
Okay, the least unlikely option would be to use the 14th Amendment. Article 1 of the Constitution says Congress has the power to pay the debts of the U.S. But the 14th Amendment says the validity of the public debt shall not be questioned, which could be interpreted to mean the debt limit itself is unconstitutional.
Say, you know what? We can issue whatever debt we want. We're not going to invent some brand new coin. We're not going to invent some brand new type of debt. We're just going to go ahead and continue to issue debt.
This is something the White House is really looking into.
I've been considering the 14th Amendment. Litigated.
If you did invoke the 14th Amendment and financial markets thought you had a good enough chance of prevailing, they would continue to lend you money, and so you'd be buying yourself time. It might be that the courts supported the theory of the 14th Amendment. The problem is you may not get that outcome. You may get the opposite, and then you're back to the drawing board with having created a bunch of chaos.
But even if the 14th Amendment isn't invoked now, it might be for future debt limit battles.
I'll be very blunt with you. When we get by this, I'm thinking about taking a look at months down the road as to see what the court would say about whether or not it does work.
Also, one path House Democrats, not the White House, could take is something called a discharge petition. Basically, if Speaker McCarthy refuses to bring a clean debt ceiling raise to the House floor, a majority of members could bring it to the floor after a lengthy process. It's in the works, but many experts say this isn't highly likely either.
Discharge petitions rarely succeed, and when they do, working through the process can take more than a month, and we do not have more than a month to resolve this issue.
Which is why those in charge of the country's financial system say,
There's only one way forward here, and that is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling so that the United States government can pay all of its obligations when due.
The only good outcome is one in which Congress acts to raise the debt ceiling.
in order to avoid
I'm not even speaking. I was like, so debt really don't matter, because in the end, they're just gonna say, nigga, we make that. Your ass is gonna have to wait for that money. That will never be paid off. And then World War III. Tell me I'm lying. I'm crazy, huh? All right.
grade possible, AAA, since they have a long history of paying people on time.
The federal debt ceiling. It's a looming catastrophe. It's a bargaining lever. It's a crisis averted. It seems like a never-ending cycle. So what is the federal debt ceiling anyway, and why should you care about it? Let's start with how it works. The government spends more money than it takes in. It's done this off and on since the country was founded. But now it's doing it more than ever. In each of the past 4 years, it has spent over $1 trillion more than it took in. In February of this year, it is projected to collect about $215 billion in revenues and pay out $460 billion. The government borrows to make up the difference.
The 14th Amendment is central to our modern legal landscape. Decisions in cases like Brown v. Board of Education, Bush v. Gore, and the now overturned Roe v. Wade all have a legal basis in the 14th Amendment. So how can a single constitutional amendment apply to so much consequential legal precedent? Well, like a lot of things, it's a matter of
I would like to learn more of this.
Throughout the history of our country, the the United States government has done what it is supposed to do. Not too surprisingly, we pay our debts. That's what we have always done. In fact, over the past 63 years, the national debt limit has been raised nearly 80 times, 49 times when a Republican has been president and 29 times when a Democrat has been president. The debt ceiling was raised 18 times under President Ronald Reagan, 7 times under President George W. Bush, and 3 times under President Donald Trump, when the national debt increased by some $8 trillion with no strings attached. Bottom line, we pay our debt. That is what a major country does, the largest economy in the world. We pay our debts. And let's be clear, what the debt ceiling is about is paying money that has already been appropriated and spent. It has nothing to do with future budgets and future spending. You can debate that. This is simply a question of paying off what has already been spent. However, in an unprecedented and outrageous way, extreme right-wing Republicans have hijacked the debt ceiling process and have said to the American people, if we don't get our way and impose savage cuts on the needs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor, if you don't do what we demand that you do, we are prepared to allow the United States government to default and bring our economy and the world's economy into turmoil. That's what the Republicans are essentially saying. If the right-wing Republicans force a default, it will mean the loss of millions of American jobs, interest rates on mortgages and credit cards will soar, and Americans will lose trillions of dollars in household wealth. As disastrous as it would be to default on our debt, it would be equally disastrous to pass
more money. As a comparison to the share of GDP, it's around 100%, the highest since World War II. The biggest recent hike happened in 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic hit the U.S. and crippled the nation's economy.
Congress finally cleared a $900 billion coronavirus relief package just before midnight last night, and with it, a $1.4 trillion bill that funds the government through the fiscal year.
The question of whether it's economically feasible to keep adding to this mountain of debt has long vexed Congress, which is in charge of the debt ceiling, the law that decides how much the U.S. is allowed to borrow.
We Democrats supported lifting the debt ceiling because it's the responsible thing to do.
I implore them one more time not to play Russian roulette with the American economy.
As lawmakers prepare to likely raise the ceiling again in early December, here's a look at how the U.S.'s debt works and why economists say the U.S. can keep on borrowing, at least to a point, provided, of course, Congress raises the debt limit.
There are some limitations, though, on how much they can ultimately borrow, and those have to do with inflation and interest rates.
What do you mean?
Here's what happens when the government needs to borrow more money to pay for its economic agenda. First, Congress passes laws to determine spending and taxes. If the government spends so much that spending exceeds taxes, the Treasury must finance the deficit by borrowing, issuing Treasury bonds and bills.
When Treasury issues a Treasury bond or a Treasury bill, this is basically an IOU. An investor gives the Treasury some money in expectation that they'll get the money back with interest.
Greg Ip, who has covered the U.S. economy for the Wall Street Journal for nearly 2 decades, says that people view Treasury bonds as a safe option for saving. So when the Treasury sells bonds to investors, 2 things happen. First, the government gets money to pay its bills. And second, it agrees to pay investors interest.
So when the government issues debt, they will use that money to meet all the obligations the federal government has. They may use it to send Social Security benefits checks to recipients. They may use it to pay the salaries of the military or the civilians in the federal civil service. And they may use it to pay the interest on the debt they've borrowed in the past. If interest rates are zero, then in theory, the government could borrow an infinite amount because it will never have to pay any interest on it. Conversely, if interest rates are extremely high, that really limits how much the government can borrow because the interest bill would be so large.
Today, interest rates are at historic lows, which economists say means the government can keep borrowing. But the Treasury is competing for savers' money,
Not anymore.
like household.
When was this video made? 2 years ago. Okay. That explains that. Freaking getting killed by interest rate.
So if interest
Went back down though.
rates go up a lot, that's going to significantly increase the bill that the government pays for interest on its debt, in which case one of three things has to happen. Either it has to raise taxes to pay that added interest, it has to cut other types of spending, which nobody likes, or it has to borrow even more. And then you get this cycle where high interest.
Either raise taxes, cuts, or raise the debt ceiling. Damn, I see why raise the debt ceiling is a good. Okay, I see why. It makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Interest rates even higher, and then you have
It's the lesser of the three evils.
Dangerous cycle to get into.
But what happens when the other countries don't believe you can pay anymore? I don't know. We're still on top. It's not a perfect system, but it's a system that works. I understand.
Too. If Congress puts too much of the borrowed money back into the economy through things like stimulus checks, that can cause inflation.
If it borrows that money and then goes and spends it, and that spending exceeds the economy's ability to produce the goods and services needed to satisfy that spending, the result is too much spending chasing too few goods, and you get inflation. And when inflation goes up, interest rates go up, and you're back into that problem of the high interest bill making the debt unsupportable.
Inflation was 5.3% in the 12 months.
Hence, we have to get the interest rates back to 2%. Okay, that makes sense.
This is largely a different type of inflation.
This seems to reflect mostly temporary.
Even if it means causing a recession. Okay.
This surge in demand and a lot of restraint.
By raising interest rates, which is weird.
These transitory shortages will go away in a year or two and inflation will fall back. The kind of inflation you worry about is when you have persistent levels of spending that constantly exceed the economy's fundamental capacity to supply stuff. That's the kind of inflation that lasts for a long time.
So, back to Congress's role.
Okay, making sense. It's a balancing act. You gotta know how much people are gonna work, how much money you need, how much like infrastructure you need. It's gotta be balanced. If you do too much, you end up like China. Ghost cities. Makes sense. Okay, understand. And then then you just freaking have yeah, okay, that makes sense.
The only question is who should address it. And I hope our friends on the other side will step up and take care of it.
Since 2011, each
So,
of the
damn,
seven.
How powerful is America to be like, damn, we don't have the money now, but nigga, you can let us hold that shit. We're gonna pay you later on, fam. We got you. And the other country's like, yeah, we got you. You good for it. That's a bet. As long as they're willing to keep on doing that, that's cool. And we just gotta keep raising the debt ceiling. Makes sense. And if the day ever comes, that's the problem, though. If the day ever comes where they're like, man, fuck that. We want our cash, man. Nigga. The 14th Amendment, nigga. This debt was fake anyway, nigga. We don't even gotta pay y'all. What y'all trying to do? World War III. World War III. God damn. It's that simple, isn't it? It's all money. God damn. Y'all getting finessed by these? Oh, y'all didn't. Y'all thought they gonna pay y'all back? How? Well, then again, I could be wrong. You think it's what they money? They're gonna want their money eventually.
Restraints on the supply of a lot of products. Hopefully, these transitory shortages will go away in a year or two and inflation will fall back. The kind of inflation you worry about is when you have persistent levels of spending that constantly exceed the economy's fundamental capacity to supply stuff. That's the kind of inflation that lasts for a long time.
So, back to Congress's role.
The debt ceiling needs to be addressed. The only question is who should address it. And I hope our friends on the other side will step up and take care of it.
Since 2011, each of the 7 times that the debt limit was addressed, Congress did so on a bipartisan basis.
Congress decides on the debt limit, When the Treasury has reached it, it can't issue more until Congress votes to raise the debt limit. That's even if Congress already passed a budget that requires borrowing. This has led some to wonder, why can't we just print off the money to pay the mountain of debt?
If the Fed prints too much money this way, you're back into that problem of the Treasury spending that money
Inflation,
and
the
causing
dollar's
inflation
less.
and causing interest
Of
rates
course.
to go up.
Your
With the-
dollars are going to be worth less
It will
if
ultimately
you do it like that.
to raise the debt limit in December to avoid a default on the debt.
Listen, man, the best way is the 14th Amendment. Fam, the money we was never going to pay you anyway, fam. We make debt out here, fam. Just keep on. We got you, fam. You going to get paid. But you got to wait. The waiting will never stop. So the debt will it'll just keep on rising. No, eventually you got to pay. World War III. I think America's smart as fuck. This is the best way. While everybody's worried about that, we're like, nigga, spend on defense. Let's get these guns. Let's get these guns on board. And if this shit ever happen, that shit is over with. When I mean it's over with. But at the same time, man, we got y'all, fam. You gonna get paid, man. Just wait your turn. Your kid's gonna get paid. Never worry. But the point is, as long as everybody's getting paid now, they're cool with it. Because it's America. There's a good chance that, that you guys are going to succeed. So that's going to make our bonds worth even more. So, like, everybody bets on America. I got you. But what happens when it doesn't look like America's going to win? That's interesting. I don't know. It never happened, so. At least in our lifetime. So. But the future is not determined. Not everything's forever. I hope so. I enjoyed this shit. I'm getting fat from the enjoyment. Very interesting. This has been a good stream, hasn't it? Dun, 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 dun. Oh shit, Jeff. I didn't even see you. Where you been at? Interesting. That was a good one. That was What happens to a country when it goes bankrupt? Interesting.